Hello everybody, and I'm Diana Sykes and I work with Fife Contemporary. We deliver a programme of visual art and craft across Fife, but increasingly, I suppose, with a significance beyond Fife. We work through partnerships. We don't work from a specific venue, and so we've always seen our website as having something of the nature of a virtual venue. So it's kind of coming into its own, I guess, at the moment when life is becoming increasingly virtual. And our programme includes a range of activities which are public facing, such as exhibitions and engagement activities. And increasingly, we've been also working directly to support artists through networking and information, for example, and delivering some kinds of activities and events such as this, which we hope will be particularly of interest to artists. So for this afternoon's event, I will now hand you over to my colleague, who is our Artist Development Officer, Stephanie Chong, who will chair this afternoon's event and will guide us through what we're going to be doing. Thank you, Stephanie.
Perfect. Oh, thanks. Can everyone hear okay? Is there a bit of an echo?
A slight echo.
Okay. Do you want to mute down and see if that helps, actually?
Yeah. Need to find myself. I seem to have disappeared. You seem to be dominating the screen. Okay. This is the first Zoom, here we are, presentation that we're delivering. So please excuse any technical
hiccups. There we go. So, hi everyone, welcome to our Black History Month celebrations. I guess this event has been prompted by the Black Lives Matter movement. And as a team, we wanted to explore, as an arts organisation, what we could do to actively engage with and address inequalities within the sector. So we decided that this event would be a positive way to listen, learn and share projects that already exist and are champion educating and exploring work by people of African and Caribbean heritage and backgrounds, and that are also Scottish based. So we wanted to share with our networks and learn from our speakers and see where it might take us in future programming. And we hope you enjoy listening to the great lineup of speakers we have today. So just before we begin, there'll be 4 presentations that last about 20 minutes each, and then we'll stop filming. We will then host the question and answers at the end, and you'll have the opportunity to turn your cameras on so we can feel more of a kind of, conference, and you can unmute and ask your questions at that point. But if you have any questions during the presentations, I'm happy to pop them in the chat box. I'll save them for the end. And as the speakers share their projects and information, I'll be putting any of the web links that they want into the chat function, which can also be saved at the end, and I'll explain how to do that later. So that's enough for me, I think. Let me introduce you to our first speaker, Tiffany Boyle, who is Glasgow based and is one half of Mother Tongue, which is a research-based led independent curatorial practice who's working locally and internationally, and it formed in 2009. She's going to discuss the project Afro Scots. And so Tiffany, if you can start screen sharing, that would be super. There we go. Perfect. I'm going to mute myself now.
Yeah, hi everyone, sorry for the technical hiccups. Well, thanks to Diana and Stephanie for the invitation to speak here. It's very welcome, and it's lovely to be alongside Ashanti, Wezi and Veronique. So as Stephanie introduced, I'm going to be speaking about a particular body of curatorial research with archival and collection based methodology kind of at its core. that myself and collaborator Jessica Carden have been working on since late 2015, I guess, in some kind of formal way. So in terms of the presentation, I'm going to touch upon the rationale and context of the project, the way that it thinks about visibility and strategies for countering absences in terms of programming and art collections in Scotland. So in terms of the structure, I'm going to begin by discussing the origins of the research before discussing a particular cohort of Afro-Caribbean artists who were active in Scotland in the 1960s and 70s. And then hopefully as we go along, maybe some of these kind of wider questions that the research asks about visibility and the means to kind of counter this can kind of permeate all of our thoughts. And by that, I'm especially thinking about archival research as a means of excavating and putting back together narratives of certain moments, activities, and exchange, seeking to do such excavations without any clear indications of the parameters of what may or may not exist. So I'll come to it a little bit later on. I was researching the Commonwealth Institute in Edinburgh, their historic programme. That this institution doesn't work anymore, or it doesn't exist anymore, I should say. And we still don't know if we found everything that there is to know about that because there's so little documented. So you're always kind of working with it, kind of your known unknowns, your unknown unknowns, et cetera, et cetera. And so the third thing I think would be great to keep in mind as we go is that there's a real issue with the displacement of archival items and material beyond Scotland, beyond the particular communities and geographies to which this research is speaking of. So in this research, we had to travel to go and find that and are now trying to kind of embed some kind of trace of that back here. But I think that that's really one of the major issues in terms of archives and collections here is that that there's not actually very much in Scotland speaking to this. So in brief, the Afro-Scots project seeks to bring into a single narrative for the first time the work, presence, activity and exhibition histories of Black artists in Scotland working historically up until the present, and that chronology begins as we currently know around the 1860s, but there are some kind of quite large gaps in the chronology. So it is fairly historic. In looking for and collecting this kind of knowledge, we've also been able to map out the works of Black artists in Scottish art collections, which are severely lacking. And also encountered material regarding various initiatives designed in different ways to address a lack of racial diversity in the arts in Scotland, primarily from the 1980s onwards. And I have to say that it's very depressing because it comes clear very often that this has been a kind of pattern of things being created and then cut, or things being very short-lived. And this has definitely influenced our thinking as curators about the infrastructure and networks that we're all working in. So this has kind of, although it's not kind of part and parcel with the Afro-Scots research, it has made its way into the public domain in other forms. For example, this text, which I was asked to write for the GSA Student Magazine Art Review Glasgow back in April 2018 about the withdrawal of Transmission Gallery's RFO status. So in terms of the rationale in putting together an Afro-Scots art historical narrative, so there are of course Black British art histories and there are also Scottish art histories. For very complex reasons, there's something that is kind of mutually exclusive between these two coexisting. I'm not going to read out this quote that's now on screen in full, but it's a passage from art historian Eddie Chambers. He's primarily based in Texas now, and it's part of the introduction to his seminal text Black Artists in British Art History Since the 1950s, published by I.B. Torres in 2014. And within this introduction, he's lacking the manner in which he's using Black British whilst realizing that it's potentially a bit of a misnomer. So he's teasing apart why, for example, Black English wouldn't be appropriate, even though he's not, he says, it doesn't really venture west into Wales or north into Scotland. So this is Eddie's writing and some of the ways in which he kind of approaches terminologies and systemic erasures has been very influential. And in this next slide are some of what might be considered the mainstay titles of recent Scottish art history. So for example, in the top left-hand corner, there is the catalogue for the Generation Project, which was produced alongside the 2014 Commonwealth Games Cultural Programme, which surveyed 25 years of art in Scotland, featured over 100 artists, and to the best of my knowledge, included the work of 2 POC practitioners. So thus, we understand the Afro-Scots Project to also be a vehicle towards dismantling the whiteness of the Scottish art historical narratives that we have, in kind of trying to put out there that Afro-Scots chronology. We're very interested to see what other people might do with that. So the Afro-Scots research began with a 2012 project, a fairly small one. It's part of an exhibition titled What We Have Done, What We Are About to Do at the CCA Glasgow, which was part of an AHRC research project with the Glasgow School of Art that they were working on. And this research project was looking towards alternative art histories for Glasgow, contending against the kind of very well-known Glasgow miracle stories that the kind of journalists always tap onto, as kind of coined by Hansel Cobrist. So we encountered during the archival research for this project artworks, documentation, and other ephemera from exhibitions at the CCA and its former iteration as the Third Eye Centre, the work of 2 artists. Maud Salter, a Scots-Ghanaian artist, born in 1960 and passed away prematurely in 2008. And Oladele Bamboy, who was born in Nigeria and moved to Scotland at the age of 8. He no longer works as an artist now. He's London-based and works in technology. So although we had already known of their work, sorry, I've moved forward one slide too many, it spurred for us a reflection on their absence from Scottish art historical narratives. The archival sources highlighted their experiences of working as Black artists in Scotland, and that their experiences of being based in Scotland led them to leave for elsewhere, either permanently or for extended periods of time. So, for example, Oladele writes about being constantly exoticized, and he first moved to Berlin before he then moved to London, and he described this as defecting. Equally, through conversations about Maud and Oladele with peers in Scotland, we could sense the importance for the local arts community to reassert their significance and the bearing that their retrospective practices had for Scottish art history. So the exhibition at the CC was then restaged in Malmö in Sweden in 2013. And for both the Glasgow and Malmö editions, we wrote an accompanying essay in which we discussed the whiteness of the Glasgow art scene and the aesthetics of the work that's associated with the city, at least then, as well as acknowledging at the beginning of this essay the issues of our authorship as 2 white curators for this project. So I had been involved separately to all of this in the cataloguing of the transmission archive around 2009, 2010. So I was also aware of exhibitions that had taken place in the early period of transmission from really seminal Black British practitioners such as Keith Piper, Eddie Chambers, and Labina Hamid. And so that after the kind of Malmö show, this kind of led us to the research to kind of slowly snowball, and in time in 2015 we then decided to apply for some funding from the Paul Mellon Centre down in London, which then kind of facilitated the archival and research that's underpinning this talk. So I thought, in terms of trying to give you a sense of some of the kind of stories which the Afro-Scots project kind of reveals and has been seeking to make visible, I thought I would select the 1960s and 70s era, particularly Afro-Caribbean artists. A lot of this activity kind of centers around Edinburgh. So the artists which I'm going to be speaking about have a particular connection to Guyana. They were all Guyanese. There are Donald Locke, Frank Bowling, and Aubrey Williams are all very significant artists. You might have seen the Frank Bowling retrospective that happened at Tate last year, and some of the research that I'm going to be speaking about was also published in a Map magazine article a couple of years ago, so you can find that online as well. So I'm going to be starting in 1959 and with Donald Locke. So he was born in Guyana, you just saw him in the last slide, and in his lifetime he lived between Guyana, the UK, Arizona and Atlanta, where he passed away in 2010. So he came to Edinburgh in October 1959 with a scholarship from the Guyanese Ministry of Education, and he studied on a 5-year programme that was kind of more PhD, but it was framed as a master's at the time. He graduated in July in 1964. The same year that he commenced his studies in Edinburgh, his son, the very well-known artist Hugh Locke, was born in the city. So he took this split programme between the university and ECA, and unfortunately that's kind of made it harder in terms of the university's records to locate more details. So for example, his graduate dissertation and his degree show, there's not any trace of them, and normally every year ECA students all line up and they have their photo taken in the kind of courtyard, and the only students who aren't included in that are those who were on the split programs with the university. So that's a shame in the sense that doesn't seem to be so much trace of him, but there are records, university records, which tell us other things. So some of the modules he was studying and his grades, and he won a number of prizes during his studies. So all of the artist's twin forms were produced during his studies in Edinburgh, which was then followed by a period of painting for 5 years when he returned to Guyana with his young family due to the lack of facilities. He wasn't able to access kilns when he went back to Guyana. Then in September 1969, he returned to ECA for 5 months on a British Council bursary, taking with him plaster molds, which he had been working on in Guyana in preparation. There were 2 ECA tutors who were particularly important for him. There were Katie Horseman and Dave Cohen. Cohen was from the US, and he kind of promoted some really strong links between the USA and Edinburgh that were also really significant to Locke, and which helped to make that move stateside, first to Arizona and then to Atlanta through a Guggenheim Fellowship. So during the studies and following this for quite a number of years, Locke participated in and also curated exhibitions in Edinburgh. Again, that's something of which there's not a whole lot of documentation. So one of the examples of an exhibition in which he participated was the retirement exhibition for his tutor Katie Horseman, which was titled Code 9 Down. There's a little bit of a discrepancy whether this takes place in 1974 or 1976, but it was a group show at the New 57 Gallery, which is now what we know as Fruit Market in Edinburgh. And this is likely one of the last instances of Locke showing in Edinburgh, but I think it's really interesting if you consider him coming in 1959, that all the way up until the mid-70s, he's still kind of being included in projects and is still kind of in dialogue with his peers there. So unfortunately, I don't have any documentation of that show, not for lack of trying to find it. Going back a year earlier, this is an article from the 18th of January 1965, which describes a pottery exhibition in Edinburgh that Locke had, featuring 25 pots, of which apparently all of them sold, but where those might now be is a bit of a mystery. However, in these slides, so in 2017, I had managed to get some money to go and meet Locke's widow, his second wife, Brenda Locke, so that I could see some of the work that he had created whilst he was in Scotland for the first time. And then I arrived there and she said, oh, well, I've actually got some news for you, which is that just really recently and completely out of the blue, 3 of Donald's early student works have suddenly cropped up in Edinburgh. And so they had been found in basically there was a couple who largely worked abroad, and they had bought a flat and it used to belong to ECA students, and they had left some works. And so this couple had his work by default. They had misremembered his name, but they liked them, so they always kept on to them. And after they retired, they brought them out again into the kind of bigger house that they were retiring into and realized what they had. And so I'll come to this a little bit later, but the two works, not the one with the kind of two horns over on the left-hand side, but these two other works, through our current collaboration with Glasgow Museums, thanks Stephanie, have now entered the collection of Glasgow Museums, along with mixed media canvas work, a later work. So in 1962, Locke curated an exhibition titled the West Indian Federation Commemorative at the Paperback Bookshop and Gallery in Edinburgh. And again, like the New 57 example, all I really have to show you is the exterior, I'm afraid. But this is a later picture. So for this show, Locke went down to London to meet his contemporary Frank Bowling and to bring up a painting of Bowling's to be in the show. This photograph is actually from later, but I think it kind of helps us to imagine what that first meeting between the two of them was, and they continued to be peers, colleagues, friends throughout their life. And I found it really interesting that Locke moves into a kind of organizational, even a curatorial capacity. And I think that there's a really strong sense of him promoting and making visible the work of Caribbean and diasporic artists in Edinburgh that also suggests that he felt there was an audience for this and that he found willing partners. So Richard DeMarco was part of the Paperback Bookshop and Gallery, or of the basement of the Bookshop and Gallery. And in 1967, he organised an exhibition at the Hume Tower on Edinburgh University campus that's been under much discussion lately. This exhibition was the Edinburgh Open 100, and Frank Bowling was selected to be a part of this, and he also won a prize with his painting My Guyana, which was in the Tate retrospective. So there's these photographs. These are in the Scottish National Gallery's archive through being in the DeMarco items. But there's not actually a picture of the painting as it was hung on the wall within the context of the show. But this is a general kind of group shot of that show. So I think thinking of Locke's exhibition making, it's also really important to place this in the context of the Caribbean community in Edinburgh at that time and with other art forms. So there's quite a lot of discussion around this time of there being an Edinburgh branch of the Caribbean artist movement set up. And this was proposed by the Barbadian poet Kamal Braithwaite in 1967 to literature scholar Kenneth Ramchand, who was then a lecturer undertaking his doctorate at the university. And they corresponded for some time about how they might do this. They had some anxieties about numbers, and then they discussed things around like membership fees and really practical things like this. So this is some of their correspondence where they're moving back and forth. And this is at the George Padmore Institute down in London. So there was also at this time a Caribbean drama group putting on productions at the university, which were really well received. For example, 2 stagings of Derek Walcott's work. So to return to Frank Bowling, in between the Paperback show and the Edinburgh Open 100, Frank Bowling also exhibited as part of the 1964 show Bowling, Culbert and Stalker at the Commonwealth Institute, which was then on Rutland Square in Edinburgh. I think now it's a solicitor's office. But in terms of the press coverage at this time, it was very much Frank Bowling's work that seems to have stolen the show. So this is a review from Cordelia Oliver when she said it's Frank Bowling's work that makes a visit all the while worthwhile. However, Commonwealth initiatives were not relegated to Edinburgh in this period. In 1965, Glasgow was a host city for the Commonwealth Arts Festival, which included the exhibition 4 Painters, 1 Sculptor at Gilmore Hill Hall on the University of Glasgow campus. This was in addition to London, Liverpool and Cardiff. Again, there's not a lot of locally available, I don't quite understand why, but the archives for this project are at the Harry Ransom Center in Texas. So they're very far away. But Aubrey Williams, a very seminal Guyanese artist, he exhibited a number of his painted works in the show, which are in this next slide. And again, these 2 paintings have now entered the collection of Glasgow Museums through our current collaboration and Art Fund New Collecting Award with them. So beginning to move towards closing, the research oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. So in 2018, I think that once we had begun to draw this chronology together, it's still a kind of project in progress, very keen to do something with that, which would have a kind of a lasting impact. And we've been working with Glasgow Museums through an Art Fund New Collecting Award to develop an acquisitions programme that uses this research and brings into Scottish art collections artists who have been part of the visual art story of Scotland and have made very meaningful contributions here. And one of the reasons that we were very keen to work with Glasgow Museums is that they have the Glasgow Museums Resource Centre out in its Hill, which in some respects is quite public and it's quite accessible, and it's people can make appointments and they can, I mean, in non-COVID times, to go and see things there. So overall, we're acquisitioning the work of 8 Black artists. So far, we've collected Alberta Whittle, Aubrey Williams, and Donald Locke. And Maud Salter's in progress at the moment. And this is going to make a sizable, it's almost going to kind of trifold increase the number of Black artists in visual arts collections in Scotland. So I think I've gone a little bit over, so I'll stop there. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Tiffany. Don't worry about going over. As I said earlier, we've got quite a lot of leeway with the timings. Yeah, that was really insightful. Thanks for giving us a look into your research, and the news about the acquisitions is really amazing. So well done. Yeah, so I think we'll move on to our next speaker now, which is Wezi Mhura, who is a creative producer and has initiated and developed projects with widely diverse groups of different artists and genres, including dance, street theatre, circus, and digital to music performance as well. But she's going to focus on her most current project, which is the Black Lives Matter Mural Trail, which you maybe have seen in person because it's all in public spaces and outdoors, or in the press as well. So I will hand you over to Wezi. If she can share her screen, she will tell us more.
Hey. Hello everyone, my name is Wezi Mhura. And as Stephanie said, I'm the curator and creative producer of the Black Lives Matter Mural Trail. And I hope you can see my screen. Is that good? Amazing. So I started the trail back in June. There was a moment where the whole world responded to the horrific killing of George Floyd. And it was such a unique moment in our history, in kind of our living memory history, where the entire world took to the streets in protest, to protest injustice and to show solidarity with the statement that Black Lives Matter. And for me, the very inception of the project started with understanding that those protests that were happening, or the days that those protests that were happening, were a single moment in time, and were very much focused around the idea of Black America, and that there would seem to be a lack of the Black Scottish voice within this sort of global conversation. So the first, I have to say that this is the image that started it all off for me. So this was an image that was created by a photographer called Jamal with his daughter, following a few days following the killing of George Floyd. Jamal is Nigerian. He was born in London, but lived for the majority of his life in Nigeria, and came back to the UK as a teenager and has moved up to Scotland. His children are half Scottish, half Nigerian, and he has always looked to find a way to communicate conversations around race, around equality, around things that people find difficult to speak about. So as following the killing of George Floyd, Jamal went into his daughter's room, sat and talked to her about the context that it has created as a young Black person growing up in Scotland, but also asked her if she wanted to respond creatively. And then he posted this online. Now, initially, what my ambition for the project was that that it was a way to allow people who had not, or who did not feel too comfortable to be in large spaces at protests, to lend their voice to the Black Lives Matter and lend their support to the Black Lives Matter movement that was happening. So my initial idea was to have a single mural in each city that had had a BLM protest, and for that mural space to allow a Scottish artist of colour, a Black Scottish artist, to bring a Black Scottish perspective to a conversation. And for then that space to be a place where people could come and deposit a yellow ribbon or a black ribbon or some sort of token that made them feel that they were still part of the conversation or showing their support, that didn't feel like it always meant that they would be in a kind of, they had to compromise whatever levels of safety that they felt being in a kind of, in a large protest situation. So following me connecting in with a number of arts venues and organizations that I had personal connections with, I then was very keen to make sure that within this project and within the conversation around Black Lives Matter and about race and equality in the Scottish sphere, that the voices of the multitude get seen, that the voices of many. I'm very aware that whenever there's a conversation about being Black in the UK or the Black experience, there's always, there feels to be a kind of a London lens, or a lens that doesn't ever really involve the Black Scottish voice. And also within the media, people tend to like to have one spokesperson that then is the Black voice that speaks to the Black experience. And I was very keen to take multiple voices from multiple parts of the country and speak to artists in Inverness and ask them to create work that speaks to their experience, and which is very different from artists in Shetland or artists in Glasgow, artists in Edinburgh, or the local community or conversations that were needing to happen in different spaces. I was also very aware that public art is a very powerful statement, especially right now, when we're all looking to use our public spaces in very different ways. It was very important to me that venues, that galleries, that community spaces that would have been used to maybe start this conversation had we not been in COVID time, but maybe would have been the spaces in which these conversations would be, society tends to reflect itself back onto itself, were not open at the time. And if they could lend us their walls and their railings and their doors to bring that conversation to the public sphere, then public art could be used as a sort of catalyst to have a conversation with Black artists and with Black people and with people on the streets as they encounter art, as they encounter creativity, as they encounter a conversation that may be uncomfortable in the sphere of a boardroom or in the sphere of a lecture hall, but may be within the context of looking at the protests or the context of looking at the lived experience of an individual artist, then that would be a way that we could move people to start thinking deeper about the topics that were at hand. I was very aware that the way that human nature is, a hashtag will disappear, a day in which you made a plaque or had a motivational statement on your Facebook or Instagram, or those moments would disappear, but having things that could live permanently on significant cultural spaces in significant cities across the country would be a way to keep that conversation at the fore of everybody's thoughts, and would be a way to keep that conversation in the public sphere. Now, there has been many different artists who have connected into many different themes and topics, and I've been very clear and very aware that I'd never wanted to direct that, or to commission that, or to commission any sort of particular thought behind how or why they respond to the provocation around this moment in history. And that is as much as I've given within any kind of brief. So some people have taken a historic context, some people have taken a quote and that has moved them, that has kind of inspired them within the context of Black Lives Matter. Some people have looked at historical context. So this is a graffiti artwork that is of Frederick Douglass, who's the famous 18th, 19th century abolitionist who did a tour of Scotland, and a talking tour of Scotland. And this has actually been put onto a building on Lower Gilmore Place, which is the building that he stayed in when he was in Edinburgh doing his talks. Other people have taken slogans and statements, and you know, there was that kind of campaign, give racism the red card, like stop racism, full stop, that kind of thing, and just ran with it as a way that they feel they have been moved to respond to the provocation around Black Lives Matter. I think some of the most exciting moments that we have created within this project are the moments in which the public themselves have helped design and create work, and moments which the communities have taken ownership of artwork and things that will live on their buildings for a very long time. So this is Govan Hill Youth Project, who came together to creatively design, as young people, a statement around Black Lives Matter, a mural that will live on the Govan Hill wall and on the Govan Hill Community Centre space forever. And it felt really great that there was a moment that it took it out with the kind of context of artists reflecting back at society upon itself, and then into the sphere of community coming together to design something that they feel that they take ownership of, designing something that they feel reflects their own perspective and respects the community, and reflects the community and gives the community an opportunity for them to voice their support to Black Lives Matter as a statement that the community itself can make. We have similarly another project with Garnet Hill Community Centre, North Edinburgh Arts, and Ayr Gaiety, so the theatre in Ayr, where the community will come together, working with an artist of colour to bring ideas that will create a community mural. Now, when we had originally thought about it, we would really hope that the community would come together within kind of online and in-person workshops, and hope that they would design, bring all kind of ideas to the design, and then be able to actually put it up themselves as well, and have kind of series of kind of graffiti workshops and other things. But due to COVID, we're not really in a position where we'll be able to do that. But even the ideas behind having community spaces that have the voice of the community talking about racial equality, talking about how that sits into their own community values, has been a very important kind of product of this project, and a very important catalyst for me to keep moving and finding more spaces that will accept and will take ownership of artwork of artists of color. The other thing that I have been very keen to make sure that we are addressing within this project is the ideas around modern or the life experience of being Black and Scottish today, and taking quotes from individuals, from artists, from people in the public, from every which way, to try and create moments of conversation. Now I've been very aware that this is something that will and can trigger people. So we have been trying across the board to find positive ways to think about things while we're living through negative times. So trying to create positive stories that celebrates the Black voice, celebrates the Black Scottish voice, even if that is addressing a point of hurt or addressing a point of contention, or addressing inequality, or addressing tough subjects that push people into a corner and make people feel that they're being attacked. It's always been first and foremost about the art, about the creativity, about the artists behind it, and about them leading that conversation. And it's been such a joy to connect in with established artists who are graduates and university trained and have come through the very traditional sort of mill of working through the arts, but also working with completely self-taught artists who are young and who are energetic and who don't see themselves as creative individuals, or who don't see themselves as artists, but who also create just beautiful moments, or who create from within their own sort of spirit. The other thing that has been really exciting about this project is that, because I've been very loose and fast with the term mural, we have been able to engage with comic book artists, like this artwork that's up in Platform Theatre, video artists, mural painters, graffiti artists, and a whole range of different genres, from writers and poets to people who use acrylics and paints, to everybody in between, to showcase the breadth of Black creative talent in Scotland. And that's a thing that really is important to me, because I spend a lot of time in institutions and organizations who feel like they have a right, or they put out a call, or they do enough to call in Black artists, and then will say to me, oh, but there's nobody there, and nobody's applied for these initiatives, or nobody, we don't know where they are, and they're not making themselves known. But I think that this project itself has proven that if you take a moment to look outside of the people that you know, and to think about the ways in which you can connect people who would not see themselves as people who deserve that space, or people who are within that space of that is called a creative person or an artist, then you can find a wealth of beautiful, creative, talented individuals who are just creating within their own sphere and who don't connect in with establishment. And I think that one of the things that I am really keen to launch on the back of this project is, or to use the momentum of this project to do, is to address that sort of idea that there's no Black artists in Scotland, address that idea that these institutions can't diversify because there's not people there or not people creating. And I think that, you know, we've been on the outside of these buildings since July, or June and July, and, you know, it's now time for us to kind of turn around and knock on the door and demand entry and actually say, well, we're here, we want to be part of the creative infrastructure that makes Scotland what it is. But there has to be allowances for new ways of working, or for new people to walk into that space. This beautiful piece of work that you see right in front of us is on the glass wing of the Usher Hall, which is one of the biggest and most grand looking buildings on Lothian Road. And it's kind of, you know, at the top of sort of 3 or 4 stories, and it's huge, and it's in the middle of a very prominent and busy intersection. And this artist who came to me through a recommendation of a friend is a graffiti artist. And not a graffiti artist, is a tattoo artist. Is a tattoo artist who just creates work. And when I did several calls out on artist networks, on kind of community groups, she within herself would say to me, but I'm not an artist. And it's for me to reach out to people and say, you actually are allowed in this sphere. Welcome to this sphere. Your voice is valid. It's really important that your voice is within this conversation. And I am really excited that I've managed to connect with so many amazing, talented artists who are trained and who are self-taught and who are just have a beautiful voice that needs to be added to the nuances that is the conversation around Black Lives Matter. It's really been my genuine pleasure to connect in with so many amazing people. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Wezi. It was really insightful to see all the different kind of, or hear about all the different artists and the cross disciplines as well. And the, you know, within the mural trail, like the non-hierarchical way of presenting the work of like all voices. I think that's really, really inspiring. And it's also just like a really positive response to the Black Matters movement. You know, rather than it being inclusive to people that couldn't necessarily go to the different demonstrations. So yeah, thank you. And I'll maybe speak a little bit about the project at the end, because it's still live and it's still happening, isn't it?
Yeah, it's still live and it's still happening. And we're hoping to get Ashanti, the next speaker, in to one of my murals. Oh,
great. That would be nice to make that kind of contact. Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about your GoFundMe at the end as well, and let people know what they could do to get involved and help as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
No problem. And yeah, so now we're going to pass the mic, or the virtual mic, over to Veronique, who started a project in 2018 called Zanana, which supports the creative ambitions of Black, Asian, mixed heritage and people of colour in Scotland and beyond. But I guess I'm going to let her tell you more about it. So there we go. If you could share.
I will get started. Thank you for inviting me. Such a, really interesting presentations. Great to hear about everyone's projects in a bit more depth. So let's share my screen. Where are we? Okie doke. Let me know if you can't hear me for whatever reason. I have a tendency to throw my hair on top of my mic, which is obviously muffles things. So yeah, my name is Veronique Lapeyre, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Zanana Project and a variety of other things. Cool. So just a little bit about me. Obviously working in the craft sector, I'm sure I've met quite a few of you who might be on the Fife Contemporary call, but if we've not met before, yeah, I juggle a few different things. I'm currently the head of communications and digital at Craft Scotland, the National Development Agency for supporting makers and promoting craft all across Scotland. And I've been doing that role now for about 4.5 years. I've also recently just become the chair of Scottish Contemporary Art Network. So that's me kind of having feet in two different, very connected but different creative communities. And I'm also a committee member for Make, which is a kind of Make manifesto for craft, which is so, again, in the craft world. But essentially in my spare time, little of that I have, I do this thing called the Zanana Project, and it's changed over the years. I mean, 2018 feels like a lifetime ago. I don't know about what you all think, but yeah, it could be a whole decade ago, I don't know. But yeah, in the last couple of years, it's really kind of shifted and changed. And but my background is really in communications and marketing and digital, and that's kind of where I trained. But I started out, my undergrad was in classics and anthropology. I'm mostly focused on things like gender theory and deconstruction theory and symbolism and Greek theatre. And then I kind of made a shift into career-wise, into marketing. And obviously my background, my personal background is I'm half Scottish, half Mauritian. I grew up in Scotland. So my existence has always been obviously where I start from, and as a mixed heritage person living in Scotland, I've kind of, yeah, that's kind of what Zanana Project has been birthed out of. I'm really starting to understand how I can be of service and of help to the anti-racism action that's going on in Scotland, particularly within the cultural sector. That's a really cute photo of me and my brother there. One of the things that kind of guides me when I'm thinking about things is the idea of transculturalism. So it's not, transculturalism wasn't that cool anymore. It was kind of associated with kind of multiculturalism back in the day, and it's kind of fallen out of vogue. But to me, it was a really important concept I learned when I was a teenager. And it's more than simply multiculturalism, which is just coexisting alongside each other. It's about the kind of interspersion of difference and sameness and learning and growing and bringing things in, but also respecting your own individual cultures and perspectives. And it kind of allows humans and groups to kind of adapt and adopt new discourses and values and ideas and knowledge systems. And it really always, the thing I loved about it was the fact that it really does portray culture as always in a state of flux. Like, we're not fixed, we can change, we can grow, we can adapt, and we can move. When I moved to Edinburgh in 2016, 2017, my job as then was marketing manager at Craft Scotland. And later, when I joined the board of Scottish Contemporary Art Network, I realised I was like fully immersed in the cultural sector in Scotland by that point. And it was something I'd always grown up with. I'm from a creative family. My brother's an artist. I'm a creative myself. I dabble in illustration and sewing and things like that. And I did internships back in the day. But this job was really the first time that I was here 100%. This is what I was doing on my daily day-to-day. And then I started looking around the rooms and the meetings that I was at, and I realised that not everyone really looked like me, or there wasn't a lot of difference in what people looked like, or their personal experiences, or their backgrounds, or their class, or their education. And the more you start to notice it, the more you really, really notice it. And then I started to remember a phrase that I'd heard in a film. It was actually an Afropedia film about young African creatives who had come to Europe to go to university, and then once they'd finished, they'd move back home. People were constantly asking them, why didn't they stay in Europe, where there was more opportunities to be creative, more training, more development, more money, more exciting projects. And one of the women in the interview says, if she didn't come back home and start a scene here, a creative scene, who was going to do it? And so, yeah, the phrase she used was, if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? And that phrase has really started to, it's actually, and it keeps coming up, and it keeps kind of becoming a sort of through line in my life and my kind of practice, because I'm called to be of service to our creative community for Black, Asian, mixed heritage and people of colour. I really believe that I have a specific skill set in terms of communication, and I work within the cultural sector, and I can add my voice and I can help people. And I'm all about listening and figuring out what I can do to help people achieve their creative ambitions. As is already mentioned, you know, people of colour are not homogenous. We don't have the same backgrounds. We don't have the same desires. We don't have the same aspirations. And so, you know, we can't just have one size fits all solutions, and events or talks or whatever you're putting on needs to be kind of from multiple perspectives. So yeah, if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? Around about this time, there was obviously like some interesting but not unsurprising statistics and research papers that have been put out. This was back in 2017. Obviously, there are more research papers that have been done and more things like that. If you like the statistics, if you like the numbers and the facts, I do have a section on the Zanana website where I've kind of tried to pull all these together, because I obviously lived this and I know of these papers, but often I meet people and they're like, did you know that there's been a paper published 3 years ago? And you know, so people are still discovering things and still learning about things. So I think it's, if you like papers, that's where to go. Yeah, the Creative Scotland report, Understanding Diversity in the Arts survey, really kind of highlighted how ethnicity was a barrier to career progression within the arts. Particularly the one that was the most disturbing to me was the fact that underneath women, as they describe them, minority ethnic respondents, and even lower medium income than average. And that is then, again, less than the Scottish average income. So you've got Scottish average income, artists, women artists or creators, and then you've got minority ethnic, as they describe them. So all these sort of things kind of, you know, came together really at the end of 2017, and I started the Zanana Project in 2018. The first thing I did was I just wanted a little get together. At the time, there wasn't much happening. Now there's so many things going on. I really feel like there's been a bit of a zeitgeist in terms of people with self-initiative projects, or people discovering existing projects, and there's lots of activity happening. And we were just talking about earlier before we started the panel talk, you know, social media and Instagram has really been super helpful for people to discover people and connect and have these conversations. But at the time, way back in January 2018, I was like, let's get everyone in a room. That would be nice. And I put on an event, so I called them Zanana Socials, and we had 3 speakers. And really the conversation was all about kind of how can we make space, but really kind of by putting on that event and looking at speakers, I was thinking about what would the Zanana Project do and what's the kind of central aim, and really it's about supporting people to do what they do, and you know, shining a light on all the amazing stories and exciting projects that people have got going on right here in Scotland. Like Wezi said, we're not looking to London, we're not looking to Europe or America. There's so many fantastic people who live here and are working here. Another thing about the Zanana Project is that I'm settling into now, a couple of years after we started, is just this idea that things can change and shapeshift, and it is all about meeting the needs and the interests and the challenges of our community, and that might like look different from time to time, but really the thing that prompted the Zanana was that everyone's working in tends to be in isolation, tends to be siloed into their working disciplines, hard to access if you don't have the right connections or know the right words to say, or the right person to email, or the right phone number, or have the confidence to do any of those things. So it was to bring together people in a safe space, which leads me on to core, I would say, ethos of the Zanana Project. It really is all about safe spaces. So when I've done events, I've always been very careful to make sure that it is just the community that's present. So it is creatives of colour, artists of colour, art workers, etc. And limiting the use of technology. So that's why I don't have a lot of photos to document, but limiting the use of like mobile phones and photography and film, just to provide people this space where they can talk about what they want to talk about. where we can have honest discussions, whether those are positive or negative, or if people are needing help with a problem, and allowing people to be their full selves without this kind of pervasive documentation that we kind of have. Another kind of ethos is, as mentioned, I believe that, you know, people of colour contain universes. Our pain is not the only currency. We shouldn't just be involved in a project because of our ethnicity, or that we fit a particular project's ambitions. I think it's good to be able to just be your full self, and if your artwork is all about butterflies and you picked that arbitrarily, then that's great too. Or if your work is about your own personal experience growing up, I don't know, mixed race in Scotland, that's good too. But I don't think we need to allow people to be their full selves, and that's really important to me. Another one is fair pay and compensation. So you'll notice when I talk about the Zanana Project, it's kind of bitty. It happens sort of, I have an event and then I don't have an event, which is to do with time and resources, but it's also because I spent, after the first panel talk in March, I spent a really long time realizing that I had to pay people. I couldn't be contributing to the problem of people not getting paid fairly and having a low medium income. So I had to spend quite a lot of time trying to find the appropriate funding. But luckily there's been some new funding sources available. But fair pay is really, like, I really believe in that fair pay for artists and creative workers. And that also includes things like compensation for administration time, travel time, you know, student expenses if that's what your project involves. I tend to follow the Scottish Arts Union rates, but I've also done some other research as well. And I also believe kind of in honest and transparent operational practices. So like all my fees that I pay for people are on my website. It's all very clear, and I document that all really well so that obviously people can use that too. And I know it sounds, working within the cultural sector, you think, oh yeah, everyone talks about fair pay, everyone uses the Scottish Arts Union rates, but actually that's not the case always, and it's not always that a project is like the budget is sort of detailed in that way, and taking the time to think, okay, well, if someone's preparing a talk, for example, what kind of admin do they have to do? What else do they have to think about? What resources do they need? And just kind of, do they need, you know, computers to like deliver a talk? Those sorts of things, which is about widening participation. And one of the reasons that I was lucky enough to get funding from Creative Scotland through the Create Inclusion was about trying to make sure that, you know, we've got interpreters if we, you know, in the future, if we need BSL interpreters, or if we need to provide devices for people to get involved in events, or, you know, even food expenses, travel expenses, that sort of thing. COVID put a bit of a dampener on that, but I was going to have a travel bursary fund and things like that to just help people, because travel and transport is expensive. So like I said, yeah, honesty and transparent operational practice is really important to me, document all of that. And just this idea that's new to me, so I'm just putting it on my spreadsheet so I know, it's this kind of idea of shape-shifting activity and continuous like evolution of ideas and concepts and ways that I can support the community. And so I've had 4 Zanana socials over the years, and they tend to be different formats and things because I'm just trying stuff out. But the first one was kind of all about how do we make space for ourselves within the current infrastructure? And that was in 2018, and now it's 2020. And I kind of was like, no, the current infrastructure is there, but we need to look to the future. We need to create our own new infrastructure. We need a new model for how we're going to move forward. And I think that really is where the next kind of Zanana Project 2.0 will be focusing on, is how can we move beyond the barriers that the organizations and the institutions and the awards and the galleries and the exhibitions have created. It's not for us as people to change those, and we'll never change those. But a lot of my work now has been kind of, I'm thinking a lot more about how can we create more expansive models. So I was really inspired by this article about utopian dreams, like what would the ideal safe space for a club night look like, and then thinking about what would that look like for art and for culture too. And another thing I've just been taking quite a lot of my time at the moment is sort of the converse of that is like the flip side of it is working within the organisations that I'm a part of. So Craft Scotland, Scottish Contemporary Art Network, Make, etc., and other things and other sectors to kind of look at what are the infrastructures and how can we break that open. So thinking about things that are like decentralized power, how can we make things more equitable, how can we make things a bit more non-hierarchical but still organized, because I'm still a project manager at heart, and how can we challenge these like long-held assumptions that the Scottish creative scene hold. Because it was really interesting listening to Tiffany's talk, where she's talking about, you know, Black artists, Afro-Caribbean artists starting these initiatives. They're short-lived. They're maybe 1, 2, 3 years, and then they kind of die down, and then they kind of, you know, the next generation pops up. And from all the conversations I've been having with people, that is the cycle that we are on, and it feels to me like we're in another cycle of that. So how do we ensure that this transformation that we're going through is real and lasts? We're not just on another cycle, and you know, in the next 10 years, another generation's looking at this archive being like, oh, what happened to those, what happened to that art, what happened to that exhibition, what happened to that project? So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Hopefully I will be able to organise some more events coming up soon. The last one was in September 2020, and that was online with 3 speakers. And that was, you know, really great and really useful. But I'm really just trying to figure out a way to make things more consistent, figure out a way to get some funding to make it more manageable in terms of resources and workloads, and see if I can get someone else involved, or and so I can help share all these fantastic projects back out into the world and support people with their creative endeavours. I think that's maybe everything I had to say. Yeah.
Okay, super. Thanks, Veronique. It was really nice to hear, I guess, more in-depth information about the project and hear the work that you're doing and how the network is kind of forming. But it feels like there's a lot of conversations that are crossing. So I hope that we can kind of share our details with each other and kind of continue having those conversations. I guess more heads, and we'll hopefully be able to help solve some of these issues. Yeah. Great, thank you. So yeah, our final speaker today will be Ashanti Harris, who's a multidisciplinary, visual artist and researcher who's working with dance and performance movement alongside sculpture, film and installation, so completely multidisciplinary, as well as inspiring and engaging with the community around her. So I'm going to pass over to Ashanti, who will share her screen and tell us a bit about her practice.
Give me just a second to get
Yeah, no worries, thanks.
Okay, I think this should work. Hi everybody. As Steph said, yes, I am a multidisciplinary visual artist working with sculpture, installation, performance, film, and more recently, since the pandemic, sound, to explore themes of identity and diaspora. So for my presentation today, I'm going to do a mixture of kind of reading some things and just talking, and I've got 2 screens set up, so sometimes I'm looking over here and sometimes I'm looking over here, so if it's a bit hectic, just bear with me. So alongside my artistic practice, I'm also co-director of an organisation called Project X, which platforms and champions dance from the African and Caribbean diaspora. We produce community productions as well as professional productions, and we collaborate with artists nationally and internationally. Embedded through all of our program is education through creative learning, and we encourage all those who take part to be empowered with historical knowledge and its contemporary impact in every context they move in. Alongside this, I'm also 1/3 of the collective Glasgow Open Dance School, or GODS, a collective facilitating experimental movement research with a focus on dance as the experience of movement rather than the performance of movement. Both GODS and Project X are a continuous inspiration and influence on my individual art practice. I consider myself to be a researcher, and I'm dedicated to historical research and creating educational artworks which aim to empower. My recent projects could be considered as processes of deconstructing colonial and post-colonial narratives and reimagining them from an African Caribbean diasporic perspective, working with sculptural processes and archival objects alongside a participatory and performative framework. I'm drawn to the expanded ways an artwork can be experienced, and this has led me to work with performance, movement as dance as the main elements in my multidisciplinary art practice, as movement and dance are forms that I consider to be historically embodied, contextual, and interconnected areas of lived experience. I also apply this thinking to working with sculptural materials and processes, focusing on traditional craft and fabrication practices which embody cultures, ancestral legacies, and human lived experience. I work with craft and sculptural processes as a performative research method, physically embodying histories, cultures, and legacies through the act of making. And today I wanted to talk to you about a project I call personally to myself, the Forgotten Diaspora Project. I haven't called it that to the world yet. It's taken lots of different forms, but I refer to it as the Forgotten Diaspora Project. This project is an ongoing body of artistic research which has been inspired and informed by the work of David Alston, who is a Scottish historian based in Cromarty, whose research looks at the historical relationship between Scotland and Guyana. Guyana is the country that I'm from. And it was interesting to hear Tiffany talking about Guyana as well, and also naming some of my favourite Guyanese artists. So thanks, Tiffany. So as part of David Alston's research, he has assembled historical records of Caribbean and particularly Guyanese people of African heritage who were in Scotland during the 18th and 19th centuries, detailing their journeys, their Scottish connections, the places which they worked and resided, and the impact they had on their various communities. And the Forgotten Diaspora Project responds to this little known history. So when I first started the project, I got in touch with David and I was really kind of happy. The Forgotten Diaspora is also the title that David gives to part of his research as well. And I was so pleased to meet him. He was really, really kind. He shared all of his kind of archival research, all of the documents, everything that he had. But when he was sharing this research with me, there was kind of names and there was dates and there was maybe things from a census. There was a lot of items that had really, really, really minimal information, and it didn't feel like enough to get an understanding of who any of these Guyanese women that I was looking at actually were. So I started my own research process, and I started with what I had available in front of me, which was places that I could physically go to. So I started by doing that, and this is a picture from when I was at Cromarty Harbour, which was one of the places that some of these Guyanese women had links to. And I went to Cromarty, I went to Rosemarkie, I went to Fortrose, I went to various places around the Black Isle, as the Black Isle has a significant connection to Guyanese history, as the majority of plantations in Guyana were actually owned by people from the Black Isle, especially in Scotland. So I went to these places and I took sound recordings. I just spent time in them, listening to what it felt like, feeling what it felt like to be there. One of the women I was researching, her name was Elizabeth Juna. I had slightly more detailed records about her because she was in Scotland her whole life. And I had the place where she worked and the place where she lived and also the place where she was buried. So I did journeys, like walking from the place I knew she lived to the place I knew she walked, like literally this idea of walking where she would have been, seeing, experiencing the journey that she would have experienced, even though the time was different, and starting to piece together information from those processes, talking to people about the kind of history and like folklore of the areas, and just collecting as much information as I possibly could. So in 2019, this research contributed to a participatory performance work that I developed with Scotland-based women with African and Caribbean heritage, which was titled Second Sight. The performance and installation of Second Sight took the historical research as a starting point to create a work which dissected the ways in which these histories are present in our day-to-day experiences as the diaspora in Scotland. So I put a call out to people that were interested in making a performance, up to African Caribbean heritage women who were interested in making a performance responding to these historical women that I'd been researching. And this idea that we were going to respond in movement, we were going to create a movement-based performance. And that seemed really important because the research, it was about like the movement of women from Guyana to Scotland and back to Guyana in many of the cases with the women as well. It's also that my research methods were movement-based, like literally taking journeys, going to visit the places that these women would have been, but also thinking about the way that history is often held in the body and how, as people from the African Caribbean diaspora, how we hold this history in the body, especially when we're experiencing walking through, for example, this is a mercantile era building in Glasgow city centre that's so related to histories of women of colour and how we kind of embody this in our day-to-day bodily experiences of these places. So I put the call out and I was really so incredibly lucky because I got a really wonderful group of 7 women who came forward who wanted to make the performance. And we started off by meeting and having conversations about ourselves, about our experiences of our bodies, our experiences of movement, our experiences of the environments that we were moving through every day, and things, kind of some things that were really personal came out, some things that were quite painful came out in those, but also so much joy came out in these meetings. And we started doing these movement-based workshops that I facilitated, where we shared kind of different experiences of movements that we had that were really positive and did different processes of teaching them to each other. We also did a lot of sensory movement in response to the research. We did a lot of physically responding to some of the research, and we ended up with this performance that was performed. So I'll go back to my writing. So the work was exhibited in Civic Room Gallery, a mercantile era building in Glasgow city centre. The performance was very much a process of reconfiguring historical narratives and taking ownership of them from both an individual, collective, and community perspective. Second Sight was presented as an installation which embedded the performance within a wider body of artwork responding to the legacy of 4 historical Caribbean women, Doll Thomas, Elizabeth Juna, Elizabeth Swain Bannister, and Suzanne Kerr. Fabric sculptures, bronze plaques like the one here, and a series of short stories sat amongst the wider growing narrative. In between the performances, a sound work of stories being read aloud alongside collected recordings from the different places in Scotland that these women had been played into the space. The next outcome of the Forgotten Diaspora Project was an exhibition titled The Skeleton of a Name, which drew together sculptural and video works developed in response to the processes of speculation involved in researching silent and invisible histories. In The Skeleton of the Name, silence is made material and presented as an archive in varying forms, which are seemingly disparate, but have potential for infinite routes of speculation. So this was kind of, The Skeleton of a Name was it was kind of an opportunity for me to draw together some of the different kind of resources that I worked from. Like, as I was saying earlier, working with kind of archival documents and the very limited information that you get, thinking about where you can start to gather the material to draw a wider picture, and also thinking about the fact that everybody's individual experience is going to draw a different picture. So I wanted to create something that brought everything together and presented it in this kind of chaotic archive form. There was a few video works, there were some video works documenting performances that were quite long and durational, and there was long text works on the wall. And I really liked the idea that as everything was quite kind of long and durational and really asked you to give it quite a lot of time, that everybody would potentially have a different experience of this research. And it kind of, I like the idea that it maybe put audiences in the role of having to be active and having to figure out their own kind of connections between things and bring their own voice to creating this story or looking at the narrative of these histories. This was an exercise, as I said, I always work with movement and performance, and for this exhibition I decided that I only wanted to work with materials and objects and also films, that I'd kind of done that and there was no performance involved. And then very last minute I panicked and I freaked out because it just felt weird to not be doing things with other people. I think I get so much from doing things with other people and working in collaboration, and always kind of acknowledging that there is no single voice. It's kind of about how collective voices can start a conversation. So I got back in touch with a few of the people and some other people who had participated in the participatory second sight performance, and we did a collective reading of a poem by a Guyanese poet called Martin Carter that we kind of sat and we rewrote together so that it was representative of each of our own individual experiences. This poem is a poem that I've always felt really connected to as a Guyanese woman, but the poem also really speaks to the diasporic experience and how it's a celebration of the individual but also the collective identity. So we kind of use that as the poem as a kind of process of doing that together, thinking about our individual perspectives, but how we formed a collective identity. Oh, okay, this is the end. So, as I said, the Forgotten Diaspora Project is a continuous research project. And the most recent pieces of work that it's been, that it has taken the form of is an audio work since the pandemic for people to listen to while walking, called History Haunts the Body. And History Haunts the Body was another really great opportunity for me to go back to some of the materials that I'd gathered when I was going on these research trips around Scotland, researching these Guyanese women. And History Haunts the Body is the stories that were played in the Second Sight exhibition, alongside a single recording that I took from that first photograph on Cromarty Harbour of a ship that was kind of, I couldn't tell if it was moving towards or moving away from the harbour, but I stood and recorded and watched this ship for a really long time whilst kind of processing all of the research. And the History Haunts the Body is a combination of these stories alongside these kind of instructional movement exercises that for you to kind of do whilst you're listening to the stories. But I also really like the idea that they're kind of processes of self-care, and kind of when dealing with potentially complex and traumatic histories, that there's a process of caring for yourself and whilst you're physically embodying them through listening to them. And again, kind of spending a lot of time researching Guyanese history, but the focus being quite on like Guyanese presence in Scotland. The most recent thing that I wanted to do was going back to the last time I was in Guyana and some of the recordings that I'd made, and also the first time that I went back to Guyana after leaving when I was really young, and kind of that process of rediscovering a place and kind of balancing between somewhere being really familiar or being the place that is home, but also somewhere being so unfamiliar and so separate, and creating a sound work that kind of looked at that. And also I've been getting really excited about sound since COVID-19, and this being a really great way to connect with people that you can listen to anywhere, and the idea that you're kind of bringing your own narrative based on what you're looking at and where you are when you're experiencing the sound. So I've been really enjoying playing with that, but also working with sound as a material and thinking about how you can shape and mold and manipulate it to explore different ideas. So I was kind of going with the idea of like an echo or a reverberation, like history as an echo or a reverberation, and how that's a way that it takes form. Whilst I was going and doing the original research trip, I was going to some different churches that would have been the churches that some of these women would have gone to, different places that have different sound qualities. And I was kind of spending time alone in there and singing different Guyanese songs that I knew. And I never got to do anything with those recordings. I had this really great opportunity to go back to them. And I think what drew me to singing in those spaces were the kind of echo and reverberation qualities. But I was also thinking about what happens, like this idea of looking back or going backwards, and what happens if you approach an echo or a reverberation backwards, and the kind of like of an echo that kind of goes out into the room becomes the first like it becomes like a suck in, and like and then the kind of initial the thing that would normally come first, the kind of ha of the sound, becomes the last thing. So that idea that the breathing out becomes the sucking in, and then it ends with a kind of like a, I don't even know the words to describe it, a kind of solid moment. I just really enjoyed thinking about sound in a really kind of material way and playing with it. So the last thing I wanted to do was share with you a little bit of sound from this recent sound work that I've been playing with, that's maybe going to be part of a sound festival soon. And it's called Okay. Just a little taster, and also probably it's going to end up having moving and dancing or something with it, but that's just a little beginning. But thank you.
Thanks, Ashanti. I feel quite privileged. I feel like we're the first people to hear that work in progress, so thanks for sharing that. Yes, yeah, the insight into your practice was great. Really exciting to hear all the different ways, you know, you're collecting your research. I'm not going to comment too much more. I guess what we're going to do now is, yeah, we're going to stop the recording. Firstly, I'd like to thank the 4 speakers that have come along today to share all their projects and practices with us. So if I could get Diana, could you stop the recording, and then we can yeah, open up to some questions.